Okay, so now let's do the second price index, which is the consumer price index. And so we have already the GDP deflator. And let's just summarize again some of the differences here. So we had first talked about the GDP deflator. And now we'll talk about the consumer price index, or CPI. And then we said we cannot let both quantities and prices fluctuate at the same time, because then it becomes impossible to get meaningful values for inflation. So when it came to the GDP deflator, we had quantity and price, and let's make it a little bit nicer. And we said for the GDP deflator, the quantity that could vary, but the price was held constant in a base year. So now we do the CPI, and the difference of the CPI to the GDP deflator is, and you probably can already sense it, when we calculate the consumer price index, we assume that the quantities are constant or held constant over time, but the price can vary. So we have for the CPI a basket of goods, and we somehow assume that people always consume the same basket of goods, and we only let the prices vary. So let's say if today is the base year and you bought like every day 3 bagels, a coffee and a donut, and then we assume you always have this amount of goods and services that you consume over the years, no matter what the price is. And then we look at how does this basket change over time. So now the CPI is then calculated as the cost of your constant basket of goods and services that you consume for every year relative to the cost of the same basket in the base year. So it is a little bit similar to the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator was nominal GDP, which incorporates all the price changes, over real GDP, where we held constant the prices in a base year. Well, now the CPI is simply calculated as the cost of the same basket in a year relative to the cost of the same basket in a base year. So let's go back to our previous example, and let's just apply this formula now. Okay, so we already know that in the base year, when we hold now constant the quantities, so let's maybe highlight this one. So now we hold constant the quantities, okay, so that means what we do is we let the prices fluctuate. So now the only thing that can fluctuate are these prices here. So the blue is what's going to change. Okay, so now let's quickly do the math, and let's just calculate the CPI in year 1. Okay, so we always assume that we have 100A. So that means even in CPI in year 2, we have 100A. Maybe I can put here the number of A. and then times the price, but the price can change, plus, now again, we assume we always consume 500,000 B, so B is always 500,000 times the price of B in each period. Okay, that should have gone up here. Okay, so prices can change, but in the base year, you see the price were 510. 510. And but now, because for the CPI prices can change and we hold constant the quantities, so now we use the prices for year 2, and actually I made here that should be 50,000 obviously, 50,010, and then it is 60,020. 60,020. Okay, so now we can calculate the CPI. Or actually, before we calculate the CPI, we call it the cost of the basket, or just call it basket cost. So the basket costs are basket cost cost. Okay, so this is again 5 million plus 5 million, so that is a little surprisingly again 10 million. But now for the CPI in year 2, so again we keep the prices of, we keep the quantities of the base year, so we still have only 100A and 500,000 B, so now we have here 6 million plus 10 million, so the cost of the basket in year 2 is again 6 million plus 10 million, so that's 16 million. Okay, so now what is the cost of the basket in the base year? Well, in the base year, which is year 1, it is always 10 million. I just write now 10 mil. 10 mil. And of course in the base year, the cost of the basket is 10 million. And in year 2 now, that's the important thing, it is 16 million. So now the CPI, again in the base year, is the cost of the basket over the base year cost. So that's again times 100, that's again 100. So the CPI in the base year is also always 100. But now the cost of the basket in year 2 relative to the cost of the same basket in the base year is now 16 over 10, which is times 100, it's 1.6 times 100, so that's 160. So now we have again 2 stock variables. The CPI is a stock variable, but the change, that is again inflation, that's a flow. And of course this is now plus 60%. So now you see we got, if you remember, like 52% when we calculated inflation based on the GDP deflator. Now when we calculate the CPI based on the consumer price index, we get 60%. And I told you already earlier that most economists prefer the GDP deflator. Why? Because the CPI is assuming that we always consume the same basket of goods. So we assume that people always have, like, in the morning 2 bagels and 1 croissant and a cup of coffee. But if, let's say, the price for bagels goes up, there is a great chance that, people substitute away from the more expensive bagels to the relatively cheaper now croissant, and they start suddenly eating only 1 bagel and 2 croissants and a coffee. So we have those substitution effects that are likely occurring as a result of those price changes, which the consumer price index does not take into account. So the question is why economists prefer GDP deflator that is supposed to read why economists prefer GDP deflator, and the answer is because the GDP deflator allows for substitution effects as a result of price changes, which the consumer price index does not. So that is the main difference between the GDP deflator and the consumer price index. Again, the GDP deflator holds constant the prices of a base year and lets the quantities change. The consumer price index holds constant the quantities of the base year. It assumes a basket of goods, but the disadvantage is that even though it lets the prices fluctuate, those price fluctuations probably mask substitution effects that occur in the realm of the quantities, and they are not taken into account. So as a result of that, very often the consumer price index, or inflation based on the consumer price index, overstates inflation because it ignores the fact that people move from the more expensive goods to the relatively cheaper, but those substitution effects are easily tolerated within the GDP deflator calculation and the corresponding inflation. Okay, so let's just stop here, and I hope that the difference between calculating inflation based on the GDP deflator versus the consumer price index, that this is clear.